Good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda Benton, class of 2011 and 2023, and I am the Associate Director of Alumni Relations here at Marist. We're very excited to present this webinar tonight titled How Understandings of Trauma Have Changed Our View of the Civil War with our host, Professor Nick Marshall. I'm excited because tonight we have alumni joining us from all up and down the East Coast, stretching from Maine to Georgia. So really fun to have such a wide audience tuning in for this. Because of the number of attendees, we have muted all of the participants except for the hosts. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom. You should be able to click Q&A and direct your questions to the host, and we'll get to those at the end of the webinar. If you encounter any audio issues, you do have the option to dial in by telephone. Amy's going to drop that number in code in the chat box in case you need it. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our host for the evening, Nick Marshall. Nick is an associate professor of history at Marist. He received his PhD and MA from the University of California, Davis, and specializes in the social history of the United States and the lived experiences of people in pre-Civil War America. Nick, thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. I'm going to hand it on over to you.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. Welcome, everybody. I have to admit, I'm going to be talking about trauma, and this setup here is the same one that I used during COVID, right? 5 years ago, and I was teaching an America 1 class in this same dynamic here, and up popped in the chat, I think a guy in the class was trying to text maybe one of his friends. But what appeared in the chat as I was doing one of those first lectures in March or April of 2020 was, man, do I hate this class. And I noted it, I pointed it out to the kid. He was a little embarrassed. I think the guy's name was Chad. In any case, I think maybe I may be suffering a little bit of post-traumatic stress in the moment here. Just thinking back to 2020 and what that was all like. But the fact that I'm using that term in some way is really directly related to what I'm going to talk about tonight, because our understandings of trauma and what we think trauma entails and where it comes from, and then how we perceive the responses to it, has really changed over the last 40, 50 years here in the United States. And I think it has really affected the way that historians have looked at the past, especially about the Civil War. So what I wanted to do was just frame this discussion at the beginning with some larger questions. Then I'll get into my own research and then talk about how trauma relates to that. If all goes according to plan, I'll be done in 35 or 40 minutes, and we'll have plenty of time for questions afterwards if people want to do that. Okay, so what I wrote up here on the whiteboard are kind of the major themes. By the way, I put in a little example of the new Marist University shield up there just because I want to make sure that everybody realizes that I'm really on board with this. The new transition to the university. Okay, but here are some of the big questions that historians talk about in general, and that I think pertain directly to the topic that I'm going to discuss tonight. So the first one is presentism versus enlightening new perspectives. And that's a way that we think about how we think about the past. And presentism is a pejorative term for us in this field, which means that what we do is project our own attitudes and ideas from our own culture back onto the past and misunderstand how people felt because we think that they are much like we are or experience life much the way that we do, when we know that that is not always the case, and frequently, maybe most often, it's not the case. We might also think about this in terms of cultural differences. As an American, my experience in the world is going to be different from somebody from another country. I don't want to project my own cultural associations and attitudes onto their culture. That is going to result in me misunderstanding the circumstances there. So this is something that historians try to avoid. They try to avoid presentism. Um, on the other hand, there's an interesting dynamic here at place because there are things in the present culture, and I put it up here as enlightening new perspectives, that might allow us to actually view the past in more accurate ways because people in the past have not been made aware of certain circumstances. And in today's world, we may understand them, and then we will be able to have a new perspective on the past that will allow us to see it actually more accurately. One common example of this is women's history, right, which was not treated with much seriousness before the 1950s and 60s, really after the 1960s. People didn't think it was significant or important, but the second wave of feminism created a different way of looking at things and the significance of women in society, which allowed historians, most of them women at first, of course, to look into the past through a lens, a new lens, which revealed things that had previously been ignored. So it's not always clear that our current culture makes us misrepresent the past, like in presentism. It can be that our present culture actually allows us to see more clearly what was happening in the past. Okay, so that's always a tension in doing history, and that's going to be part of what I'm talking about with trauma. Okay, the other big question that historians deal with is the idea of change versus continuity. And so frequently when we discuss important events of the past, we try to figure out whether this represents a marked change, a big difference, radical alteration of the way people understand the world, or it's actually more about a continuous cultural response, that it's not about as much change as it is about some kind of small differences over time. So often historians will argue about one thing or another as being representative of real change, or it's actually something that's more continuous. And today in American culture, actually in American history too, I think one of the best examples of this is our understanding about race relations in America. And this has changed just over the last 15 years, I would say. For many years, we marked, especially something like the Civil War, as a moment of dramatic change. The end of slavery is significant and important. The Civil Rights Movement, hugely important in understanding the transitions in race relations in America. And those were often identified as these key points of change, major change, rather than continuity. It's interesting, though, today that especially younger generation scholars, but also just younger people in general, do not think about those things as major changes. They think of race relations as much more continuous over time, that the discrimination and exploitation has been kind of consistent, constant, and there have been changes, definitely, moderations in it, but the most important thing to keep in mind is the continuity of racism and its effect on people of color in the United States. So that's a different way of looking at the same circumstances, right? One which is indicative of more continuity of ideas, and the other one as radical breaks. It's not to say that one is correct and one is incorrect. It's just to say that this is one of those elements that historians keep in mind when they're trying to figure out what exactly is going on and how important and significant these changes are. Okay, so with that as the general framing, I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma in the United States and how it has changed and how our definitions of it have changed, and then how it's affected the way that we think about the Civil War. And it's affected the way I think about the Civil War, and maybe in the question and answer, some of you can help me try to decide whether we think our understandings of trauma are allowing us to see better, right, the enlightened new perspective about what's going on in the Civil War, or whether they are leading us astray and making us apply our own standards to something which was not the case in the past. Okay, so when we talk about trauma in the United States, almost always we need to discuss the diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic syndrome, stress syndrome disorder, sorry. And that is was first created in the context of the Vietnam War. Now we know before this, people had experienced trauma, and the original definition of trauma is a event that is unusual in human experience and that threatens one's life. It's a very specific definition. And we know that people have experienced this, and people talked about shell shock during World War I, and the emotional reactions to these experiences during war. But oftentimes that was understood or played down as a temporary experience and or an experience that happens to people who have some issues themselves, maybe have some mental health issues or some weaknesses that force them or allow them to experience things in this way, as opposed to it being a normal response to traumatic events. But it's not really until 1980 in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that PTSD becomes a real diagnosis. And that period after the Vietnam War, of course, is a period of changing understandings of masculinity and also of the circumstances that people experience in war. Fighting for a glorious cause has an effect on the way people perceive actions in war. And Vietnam, of course, was a very different experience. So the emotional and psychological responses are going to be different in Vietnam, and the field of psychology responded to it in different ways following the war as they were treating Vietnam vets. And we also have to recognize that that diagnosis and that understanding was created in the VA hospitals. The psychologists in the Veterans Administration were the ones who were working most closely on this. And they were challenging this notion that the people who were suffering, who continue to suffer after the war, were somehow had certain circumstances or characteristics which led them that way, suggesting there's some weakness on their part as opposed to a normal human reaction. So that understanding of trauma and post-traumatic stress changed things. And since then, so since 1980, it's really expanded. Our understanding of what is trauma has really expanded beyond just the activities that take place during war. And many of us can talk about these things as appropriate. Long-term sexual abuse, long-term circumstances within close relationships, abusive relationships are traumatic and are going to lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. We can come up with any number of them. The problem for historians and also other social critics is that the claim is made, especially recently. Jonathan Haidt, he's the author of a book called The Anxious Generation, which is on the bestseller list these days. He's making arguments that we are coddling in some way the next generation, the younger generations as they advance. We think of their lives as being filled with so much stress that we are in fact creating more stress for them by treating them with such kid gloves. And that understanding, that kind of critique of the field is widespread, even though it is definitely a minority position at this point. Most of us in our culture think about trauma as something which is actually relatively common in people's lives. I've had a number of experiences where friends or relatives, or just what I said earlier today about my experiencing this response after thinking about that time when a kid said that that my class was the worst possible class and that he hated the class. So in this context, we can think about these things that have become kind of, we've normalized trauma as a descriptor not of events outside normal human life, but as kind of stressful or relatively common circumstances that we now associate the word trauma with. A few years ago during COVID, my niece had to leave. She was attending college and went home, and she was depressed, angered, all those things that came with having to leave college. It was in her senior year. And her father didn't have any sympathy. My brother didn't have any sympathy for her. This is not trauma. She was calling it trauma. And he said, get up and get some stuff done. You go to you went to a wonderful college. You're now having a little bit of a timeout but this is not trauma. And this represents in some way a generational difference between understanding the difficulties of life and how younger generations are thinking of it in different terms from older generations. And almost in all these cases, the older generations say, you guys don't know how difficult life was. I know my experience of it was worse. The things that are happening to you are relatively mild. Suck it up and get back to work or do whatever you have to do. And that generational difference is definitely a part of this whole experience. Okay, so if we think about trauma, and then we think about historians who've grown up in this culture, who understand trauma in this new way, we can understand that something very different started to happen in the field of Civil War studies starting in about 1980, at the same time that PTSD became a diagnosis. So what is it that we're talking about? It's a focus on the horrors, the difficulties, the pain, the suffering, the wounds, the worst circumstances of the Civil War as a central part of the experience of the war, rather than focusing on things like the glorious victories in the battle, the end of slavery, the transformation of American society with these new amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, that go way beyond simply the end of slavery. But these Civil War amendments were hugely important for American development. But instead of focusing on those things, the focus has switched to these darker things. And in fact, that's the phrase that historians started using to describe what was going on in the field. So it's now been called the dark turn. This transition to historians dealing with the issues of the Civil War, much more related to the suffering, the specific circumstances, the traumatic elements of it, if you will, right, for our purposes today, rather than those other things. So the horrors of war, the experiences of the soldier on the battlefield, the nature of the wounds that people suffered, the long-term effects. There's been some great stuff written about Joshua Chamberlain, for example, the hero of the Battle of Gettysburg, led the charge of the 20th Maine on the second day of the battle when they ran out of ammunition, was wounded multiple times, was there to accept the sword of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox, one of the great heroes of the war on the side of the Union. But it turns out he was wounded several times, and one of these was a horrible wound that went through his scrotum, and he had experienced pain and suffering for the rest of his life. He became the president of Bowdoin College, became the governor of Maine. He was a war hero who did wonderful things and important things after the war, but his actual life experience on a day-to-day basis was extreme pain. This wound that never healed, that made it very difficult for him to even to function on many days, but which he downplayed in most of his discussions about the war and his experience. It was more about that previous interpretation. It was about the winning of the Civil War and how significant and important that was. It wasn't about the trauma that he experienced. But this dark turn, the way that people have been talking about the Civil War, this is when his wound becomes a central part of the story of Joshua Chamberlain. So you can see how just his story is an indication of the way historians are altering the way they look at the past. Now, my own experience with the Civil War history was kind of came in through the back door because I wasn't trained as a historian. My area of interest is really in the period before the Civil War. And I spent a lot of time reading diaries and letters of common people from the North in this period before the Civil War to try and get a sense of what was going on from the bottom up, a good social historian trying to understand what was significant and important to people. And one of the things that I found in those diaries and letters, now this is, remember, is before the Civil War, is the overwhelming experience of death, sickness, and suffering in those diaries and letters. Originally I was looking for stuff about the economy. I couldn't find any of that stuff. What was in there was all these discussions of the loss of children, the loss of parents, the emotional cost that comes with that, and the separation from loved ones, either physically as people are moving west or moving around in this period of great economic transition, or simply being separated them because they die young. And this was surprising to me. As I looked into it, it turned out that people were even sicker during the pre-Civil War period and dying younger than they were actually a generation before that. And this is probably due to the disease environment, the new disease environment of the 19th century, where you have, and we know this from COVID, right? When you have people moving around who have the disease, their contagiousness means that they're going to pass it on to any number of people. So the transportation revolution of the early 19th century meant that people were on trains, on steamboats, on turnpikes, are traveling all over in ways that they didn't before, and most likely transmitting disease. So the life expectancies actually in the 1830 to 1860 period shorten, just like the heights of the average American shorten in this period, probably due to the amount of calories that are going to be used during infancy and adolescence to fight off disease, this increased disease environment. So something was going on, interesting was happening before the Civil War from my experience. People were dying like crazy, and the culture had changed, right? This is the beginning of the sentimental culture of the 19th century, the sentimental culture that we have fully adopted today, right? This notion that your relationship to loved ones, especially family members, is the essential part of the experience of existence. That those relationships are key, and if they are broken, this is a moment of great loss for all of us. And today this has gotten to the extreme point where we think that it is almost inhuman for someone to experience the death of their own child, whereas in the 19th century that would have been a common experience. And this is precisely my problem when I'm dealing with these questions about the Civil War. Because as I read these accounts from the pre-Civil War period about the experience people had losing loved ones, how it was deeply heartfelt loss that they were experiencing, but it was constant. Everyone was experiencing this. And if any of you have read any biographies or autobiographies from this period, you'll know that it's basically true. These circumstances happen again and again and again, that you lose loved ones. The loss of life was a droning constant in people's experience, not a rare event. Now, we know that our experience is different, but I can give you a couple statistics that'll reinforce this. So the life expectancy, right, in 1850 for people in the United States was something like 40 years. Of course, today we're talking about 79 or so, and there's some changes that have happened recently that are worth talking about there, but we can't talk about today. The death rate in 1850 was something like from 2 to 7%, and it varied wildly because of the various disease epidemics that were going on, whereas today it's about 0.8%. So people on average were experiencing death, 7, 8, 9 times as often as they are today. We can also think about this in terms of life tables, how likely you are to live to a certain age. I have a couple statistics here. Today, you have a 99% chance to live to age 20. You have about a 95% chance to live to age 45. And about an 83% chance to live to age 65 if you're born today. Whereas people in 1850, 79% chance just to live to age 1, a 68% chance to live to age 9, a 62% chance to live to age 24, and a 47% chance to live to age 49. So the experience that they had was totally different from ours, right? For us, people die when they're old. It's a rare occurrence that people die much younger. For people living at the time of the Civil War, that was not the case. It was frequent. First of all, the families were way bigger than they are today. It was a frequent occurrence that people died within their families, whether it's their parents. It's rare for a child actually to live with both parents alive to make it to maturity. It's almost impossible for parents to have all of their children outlive them. These circumstances were just the norm. Okay, and this reality at the time also meant that we have a culture which is totally focused on this experience. Sentimental literature, which has been criticized up and down of the period, mainly written by women. Many of you may have read Uncle Tom's Cabin or The Wide, Wide World or some of the other bestsellers of the mid-19th century. Most of these things are criticized for being overly sentimental, even mawkish, over the top in their descriptions about people dying and being separated. But my experience reading these diaries and letters is that sentimentalism really was realism of the period. Everyone reading those stories would have recognized the same experiences for themselves. And Harriet Beecher Stowe makes this point in Uncle Tom's Cabin. She says, readers, you know what this is like. She's talking about enslaved mothers who are fearing the loss of their child, not because of death, but through the slave trade. And she says to white Northerners, she says, Northern mothers, you know what this is like. You've experienced the loss of a child. And of course, she's just talking about the death through sickness and disease, right? These are the circumstances. So it was common, it was understood, it was still a problem. People still hurt from it, but it was the norm. Okay, that was my experience doing research before the Civil War. Then I started reading books about the Civil War, including in 2008, the Bancroft Prize winning book by Drew Gilpin Faust, who was the president of Harvard at the time, This Republic of Suffering, which made dramatic claims about the Civil War dying, that the deaths in the Civil War were so great that this was a moment of change, not of continuity, that the experiences on the battlefield fundamentally rewrote the way people understand American history. She's right in line with this dark turn. Okay, here's a quote from her book. The work of death was Civil War America's most fundamental and most demanding undertaking. And the way she described it, this was fundamentally different from what happened to people before the war because of the deaths on the battlefields. Okay, and she used statistics that were commonly used at the time. I use them all the time as well when I was teaching at this point. And then I came to distrust these statistics and these descriptions because of my experience with that stuff before the Civil War. But these numbers are important, and they've been changing recently, by the way, and the numbers have changed in part because people are now way more attuned to death and suffering, these darker elements of the Civil War than they were before. Okay, so how many people died in the Civil War? The traditional number, all the way up until about 13, 14 years ago, was 625,000 or so, which is a large number. For the time period, 31 million people in the United States at this time. If you think about this as a percentage of the population, you're talking about 2% or so. And if you extrapolate that to the present, right, when we have 300 and some million people in the United States, the equivalent today would be the loss of lives of something like 7 to 8 million people. And that number seems huge, right? If we had a war where we lost 7 to 8 million people, you can imagine the responses to it. Remember, 3,000 people died 9/11 or so in those, and those deaths were so significant. The number of people who were dying in the Iraq War when protests started to arise because of the loss of life were tiny. So what you do is, as a historian, if you cite this number, you are going to say, this is overwhelming. Imagine what that would be like today. So this is a great way to say how traumatic the experience of death was in the Civil War. By the way, since then, 14 years ago, a guy published an article that said the death toll was probably closer to 750,000 in the Civil War. He used census data to figure this out by taking the census from 1850 to 1860, 1860 to 1870, and then 1870 to 1880, and seeing what the trends would be like in there, and then seeing how many were missing from that middle decade, the 1860 to 1870, if you were going to expect a certain level of growth. So it wasn't counting the number of dead people, dead soldiers. It was extrapolating from census returns on what was most likely the number of people who died. And so up the number to 750,000, which makes it even more effective. And I have to say, historians of the Civil War are always excited by these numbers because it makes their subject more important and more significant in some fundamental way. Okay, recently, also just last year, an article was published about the total deaths in the South. Of course, the South was way more devastated by the war than the North for any number of reasons that we don't need to get into. But a similar study suggests that maybe close to 1 million people died in the South over the course of that decade, with the Civil War being the root cause of it. So this is more evidence that historians are focused on this type of analysis of the past. Okay, what are the problems with this, though? And this is where my own research comes into play. If you make the case that this war was overwhelming, was a fundamental change, that this experience, just these numbers themselves are almost evidence enough to prove it. I think you are, because I had this experience with reading these sources from before the war, I think you're exaggerating the change. So when I looked into it, it looked much more like continuity than it did change. First of all, you have to understand that at least 2/3 of these, and anybody who's read about the Civil War knows this, right? That the vast majority of the deaths during the Civil War were caused by disease, not by bullets or artillery. So the experience that people are going to have with these deaths is going to be very different if their loved ones died from disease than it is going to be if they died on the battlefield. And I would argue that it's going to be much more similar to their experience like it was before the war, when they had the loss of loved ones through disease. So right away, as soon as you start thinking about these numbers, you can start to doubt a little bit this claim that death was the central experience of what was going on in the Civil War. The other problem with the way people understood this is that they talked about the emotional responses that people had to death in the Civil War. And I think they make the mistake of not comparing those descriptions to the ones from before the Civil War. So if you look at them both, you see, oh, these are very similar. And when you take away the deaths from disease, the increase in deaths over the course of the Civil War start to look like 10 or 20% as opposed to much more than that. And that means that it's much closer to the changes in death before the Civil War and actually after the Civil War than these numbers would make you believe. So I became a skeptic about this dark turn and these claims about the importance of death in the Civil War. And I wrote an article, it got published, and thank goodness, but got a lot of criticism from people who said I was discounting the experience of the common soldier when I made my claims. I never said anything that it was easy to be a soldier or the loss of life was not a difficult experience for all the people involved. I just said that if we focus on the numbers and make these claims based on the numbers plus the descriptions of the experience of losing loved ones, that we haven't actually made a convincing argument that this is major change. However, a lot of people didn't like that. It seemed like I was arguing that things weren't so bad, that the Civil War was actually, not that different from the periods around it. And I was somehow discounting the sacrifice of the soldier and the experience, the suffering that people had in the war. I don't think I was doing that, but I can understand that criticism, right? By saying that this wasn't all that different, by me making the continuity argument as opposed to the change argument, I was in some way working against this dark turn and this notion that this war was somehow this overwhelmingly terrible psychological and personal experience. Okay, is that a fair critique from my point? I think it is when you're talking about the experience of death. Those people before the Civil War were, in fact, had experience with this. This was their life. It was a culture that understood death as an important part of it. It's in the poetry, it's in the literature, it's in all forms of media from the time, it's in these diaries and letters. So if we think about trauma as something that's an unusual event, unusually threatening event, I don't think we can argue that that's what people experienced during the Civil War. Okay, however, I'm starting to doubt this, right, in some way. Not my own ideas about the numbers, but just the criticism that people wouldn't be experiencing this death in the same way that would be today. So I was claiming that these historians were too present-minded. We were projecting our own feelings upon the past, our ideas about trauma, instead of actually listening to the sources themselves and hearing what they had to say about it. But now I don't want to say that I've completely converted to the dark turn, but I started thinking about the reality of everyday life for people in this current society, that our expansion of that definition of trauma, which we can criticize as perhaps going too far, but our understanding that there are experiences in even in our lives today that would not even be close to what they were experiencing at the time of the Civil War, can have long-lasting, deep effects. If anybody's dealing with grief, right, we have come to understand how powerful those feelings are, and how difficult it is to deal with them without, in some ways, modern psychological interventions. It's also true, however, we have to keep in mind that there's a whole psychology of resilience that's now in play when it comes to post-traumatic stress. It's true that many people experience traumas, but it turns out that a much smaller percentage of those people actually get PTSD. So you can experience a traumatic experience, circumstance, and then get past it. You can have a brief period of suffering. You can have a brief period of responses to it. But the long term, right, multiple years, flashbacks, inability to sleep, the mood changes that are associated with being sucked right back into those circumstances from your trauma. That is a relatively small percentage of the people who experience traumatic circumstances. And there's a whole science of resilience that's trying to figure out ways that we can make ourselves and our children able to respond, able to cope with traumatic events in ways much more healthily than we were in the past. Okay, but knowing that also then puts this question out there. What was it like to experience the Civil War? Not just for the soldiers, but for the people in surrounding areas, for the people back home who are losing their, who see their soldiers go off to fight, who are worried about it. The disease circumstances in this period are really rough for any number of reasons. So whether it's different from before the Civil War or after the Civil War, maybe is not the important question. Maybe it's that our understanding of how important the breaking of these relationships is, and the grief and the associated trauma that we experience with it, that we now know should help us to understand what they were experiencing. They didn't write about it. They didn't talk about it in the ways that we talk about it today. They didn't have the language for it, but they also, again, were experiencing this as commonplace rather than unusual. But maybe that's not the place where we should figure out whether they were experiencing or not. Maybe in a culture that values loving relationships, the breaking of those relationships, whether they're used to it or not, is a traumatic experience. And it doesn't matter whether they died from sickness or on the battlefield. My previous complaints maybe are overblown. I'm now starting to think that we need to be way more sensitive to the psychological strain and suffering that people went through in the past. That it's not presentism that's telling us that it's not presentism that's leading us to think that they're thinking in a way that they didn't think. It's in fact a new enlightened perspective that's allowing us to understand what they experienced better than they did perhaps, or that other historians have since then. So in some ways, I'm open, especially if we get to some questions here, to ideas about whether you think that which direction I should go as I work through this. Is it to to continue to doubt, to see the circumstances there as related to my previous work, that this is not something that is affecting them in the same way that they would have been used to it, or whether it's really we really need to rethink this and look at the sources in different ways and figure out the suffering that people were really going through at the time. Okay, that's where I'll end it. Happy to take questions, talk about them. Amanda, are we on time? Is that
Yeah, no, that's great.
seven 7:45?
If anyone has questions, feel free to keep dropping them in the Q&A. I have a couple to get us started that came in throughout. First was, you mentioned COVID and the various ways people experienced it and whether or not it was acknowledged as traumatic by the people around them or societally. Do you think 150 to 200 years from now, people are going to be having a similar conversation to the one we're having now about the Civil War, but about the pandemic and its impact?
That's a great question. There's super interesting differences between COVID and other circumstances. And the most important one, I think, is, of course, that the age of the people who died in COVID. We can talk about the difficulties of living isolated lives and spending times, in our homes and away from loved ones, and people being not being able to go to school and socialize. I don't think those are trauma in the sense that we really are talking about trauma here. But we are talking about close to 1 million people who died. And yet, I've been struck by how little people have been talking about the importance of those deaths. It seems very different from the way people talk about the Civil War. And I think almost all of that is due to the fact that the vast majority of those people were very old. And we allow ourselves to think that that death is different from the death of somebody who's very young. So in our culture, the death of a child, horrible experience, everybody is going to suffer, and everyone agrees on that. The death of an old person is something different. So if the coronavirus had been different, if it had been like the flu of 1918 and killed a lot of really young people, I think then we would be really thinking about this in different ways. But because of the age, I think it's just not going to be understood in the same way. And I think probably we all experience that. It seems to be fading, right? It's not hanging there in our collective consciousness, I think, in the same way.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm going to skip a question and come to this one because I think it kind of plays in a little bit more to what we were just talking about. It's more of a statement than a question, but I feel like you can run with this. I'm curious how empathy plays into it and whether or not we have become more or less empathetic as we experience less death, less grief, and less trauma that's been normalized.
Wow, that's a super interesting question. Also, right, these notions of sympathy and empathy were really coming, people figuring out actually the word empathy first used, if I'm recalling correctly, in the late 19th and early 20th century. Sympathy is related to empathy, and we think of them as somehow different, but I think ultimately what we're talking about is a similar experience. That really is a product, our understanding is that it really is a product of the 19th century, this same period that we're talking about. Um, so we've we have become a sympathetic and empathetic culture in general. We feel people's pain in some ways. Um, that is something which we all assume to be an essential part of being human. Um, we could have a long discussion about whether the last 10 years and the politics of the last 10 years have changed that dynamic. Um, I think it has a little bit. I think we're in a moment, a cultural moment, when it's harder for people to feel empathy to people who they disagree with politically. Um, and but I think these are things that are going to be going in waves. My hope is, and probably everyone's hope is, that we're going to get back to something that's a little closer to, feeling those connections to other people, other Americans who are different from you, but also people around the world. Um, Trump and Trumpism in some way is a challenge to this. Ideas about America first, ideas uh, about the opposition being the purpose of the opposition being fundamentally evil as opposed to just misguided. Um, and this can be both on the left and the right politically, but certainly I think this has become exacerbated in the present climate. Um, yeah, that's worrying, and it's a concern. Certainly, I feel that way.
Great, thank you. So this question might be a little bit of like a left turn, but I like it and I want to hear where you go with it. So during the Civil War, opium was often given to those experiencing pain in the same way that aspirin is sold over the counter today. What effect do you think this had on the people at the time who were experiencing pain? And I think the question is then also, are people today, who use opium and those drugs just getting rid of pain in the same way? Or how is it our view that's changed, or is it kind of like the action?
I mean, I don't know. Yes, opium was used. Yes, people. But the experience, we know this. The experience of the soldier, the common person, even in the middle of the 19th century, was full of way, way more pain than we experience ever today, right? Just the simple facts of life meant that you hardly had any painkillers, but you also were suffering from disease that was going to cause incredible amounts of pain. So the people in the 19th century lived through stuff that we don't have to live through at all. Um, my understanding is in the Civil War, people were using these things to try and help people. It was relatively small. It was relatively ineffective. And many people suffered in ways that we can't even imagine. And certainly medicine has changed dramatically so that the experience of, and other people are more knowledgeable about this than me, Civil War medicine was in fact just gruesome and horrifying in many ways, whereas medicine for military today is so much better for the American military. So people's experience with pain has changed dramatically since then. That's something, the history of pain is also something really interesting to discuss. How people think about it, how people experience it, and at least in the present day, how we try to avoid it at all costs. But I don't have much to say about, That's about all I got there. I don't think it was a left turn. It maybe was a dark turn, right,
Yeah,
towards pain.
absolutely. Um, this might be put you on a little bit on the spot, but do you have examples of language that was used by 19th century Americans in diaries or letters that indicate how the breaking of these relationships were traumatic or how they describe the experience of losing loved ones?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any right here with me. I could pull up a couple things if I spend some time on the computer. But the language looks very modern. Over and over again, people talk about this. Oh, the pain that I feel, she's gone and I'll never be able to see her again. My loving daughter, that was the light of my life, I'll no longer see her. Um, the same things that you can imagine that we would write today or think today with the loss of a loved one, they were using in that moment. So if whoever's asking the question wants some real specific stuff, just send me an email and I can direct you towards some of these things or give you a few quotes. But it's just, it's not all that different from the way we would talk about it today. That's what's amazing about it because people did not talk about it that way before the 19th century. This is when this culture of feeling grows and that culture takes hold by the time we're into the middle of the 19th century in ways that look very, very modern.
Thank you. Um, Are you able to tie your work back? You kind of did this a little bit to the current climate of American culture and race today. Can you still see some of the ideals that you've studied present in culture today?
Was the word race in there? I missed that, or was that?
Yes, the current climate of American culture and race.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating. It's really fascinating to see generational shifts in the way people understand race relations. And in my own family, I have two. I'm in the middle. I may look like I'm 26, but I'm actually a little older than that. Um, I'm in the middle. I have some children and nieces and nephews who are really negative about race relations and their current circumstances in the United States. I have a mother and a father-in-law who were real participants in the civil rights movement who think that that was the most important event of the 20th century and even today. And that the changes in the Voting Rights Act, in the Civil Rights Act, the legal ending of discrimination was super important. Um, then the younger generation, that one of my children and especially a niece that I have, who would argue that they are relatively insignificant in the big picture. And that argument, which happens at Thanksgiving and other times between the very old people and the very young people, is harsh and extreme. But it's so clearly an indication of a changing view of the culture over time. Our ideas about the past are changing based on our experiences in the world today. And that's just a reality. We all know that in some sense. But this is like the best example of that. And I don't know who's right in that argument. I think if I'm sitting at that table, I would be kind of professorial, trying to mediate between those two arguments and saying, "Oh, I do think there's some real significant change here, but it may not be as much as as the people who lived through it had hoped for, and it may not have resulted in the changes that we might have been thinking about in the 1970s or 80s." From my personal experience, I think I'm probably in the middle of of that discussion.
No, thank you. I think that makes sense. That's all the questions we have, but we do have a comment that I want to read. This is from
Okay.
Anna, and she says, I work closely with colleagues in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. There is a widespread belief that the trauma exposure is so high that it has been normalized and doesn't have as much of an effect. But so far, the data that they've collected suggests that rates of PTSD are as high as you would anticipate given repeated exposure. And even outside of diagnostic levels, mental and cognitive effects are there. So, kind of this idea that you can experience it as a collective, and just because other people are experiencing it doesn't take away the trauma impact on you. So, just wanted to share that because it was provided and thought it fit in well with your what you were presenting.
Well, I mean, I think that's an excellent point, right? And it reinforces this notion that things can become normalized and yet they can still be traumatic. That earlier definition that trauma only comes from things that are outside the normal experience, we probably have to rethink that. And we have, most people have in the field. So that experience that was just described in the comment, I think is absolutely on track, right? Uh, Part of what happens when people live in a war zone over the course of many, many years is that they are experiencing these things, and yet they're experiencing it as normal life. It doesn't mean it's not traumatic. So yeah, maybe that's partly how I'm trying to reevaluate my own understanding of the Civil War, which is maybe I was too dismissive of this notion that people were experiencing trauma because it was obviously just a central part of everybody's existence. So that's another piece of evidence to help push me in that other direction. So I appreciate that.
So one more question did come in, and it asks if you can talk about the difference between moral injury versus trauma.
Um, I don't really know what moral injury means in that context.
That's fair. That's the extent of the question. I can give them a second to see if they type more, but
Okay.
uh,
Um, part of this is a definitional question that has to do with the diagnostic and statistical manual and how people are understanding trauma over time. So it was pretty narrowly defined in 1980. It's much more broadly defined today. Moral injury, I'm not sure what that is, but if people are experiencing something which is devastating in some way, which they feel threatens their sense of existence, then that I think can be understood in newer definitions as traumatic. So I'm just making a guess on moral injury in that case, but it's going to be depending on the circumstances that might in fact be traumatic. The other thing is that, as I was saying earlier, just because one experiences trauma doesn't mean you're going to end up with PTSD. And how the experience and how one can react to that and actually prepare oneself for that is important these days. And that's kind of where the psychology is turning today, about resilience and how we can create it in advance, in some way inoculate ourselves against trauma, against PTSD once we have trauma, but then also react to trauma once we experience it in a way that will limit or diminish the the diagnostic criteria that one would have. So to go into PTSD rather than just to recover.
so again, kind of a specific question here, but wondering if you're familiar with the works of Benson Lossing, who grew up here in Dutchess County during the Civil War and wrote over 300 books.
The name's familiar, and I may have read some of them. But if there's a specific reference, that would be great. But also, if there's stuff in there that speaks directly to this, then I would love to read it. So whoever's writing in, let me know what the citations are, and then give me your name, and I'll read something and get back to you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, send us a recommendation. We'll
Yeah.
definitely get that out there. So that's all the questions that we had come in. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to everyone who logged on. I appreciate you all joining us and keeping, the Marist Alumni Association and Marist University in your life. Um, and we did record this, so we'll edit it a little bit because I know there's a little bit of talking at the beginning. But we'll make this presentation available in a few days and email it out to everyone who registered. So if you know someone who registered and wasn't able to log on, we'll get it to them as well. But thank you again to Nick, and thank you to everyone. Have a wonderful evening.